Good morning, one and all. £7.8 billion later, 2.7 million people who have claimed. What am I talking about? Well, that's what the stats were on the first self-employed grant that was made available earlier this year. All claims for that stopped on the 13th of July. And if you're at home thinking, what's he talking about, self-employed grant? Well, we're going to delve into that and dig deeper in this particular broadcast. My name is Mahmood, as it says so on the screen. So coronavirus, unless you're living on Mars, you can't escape that it's had a massive, devastating impact in our social lives, and it's also had a massive impact if you're in business. Now, my reason for the broadcast today is because one of the big planks of government support that was made available to businesses, specifically self-employed I'm talking about today, was something called the self-employed grant. That's not its official title, but the official title's far too long to actually go into. So we're going to explore that in terms of the second grant that became available on the 17th of August 2020. And I've got a number of conversations I've had with clients who, for whatever reason, haven't claimed the first grant, a bit concerned about the second grant because some of the wording, some of the conditions of the eligibility. So my role today is to go through the second grant, remind us about some of the conditions, talk about some of the headlines in there, and obviously answer any questions that you've got coming in. If you're listening to this on replay, thank you very much for lending me your ears. Hit that hashtag replay in the comments box. I know you're there. I can say hello. But more importantly, if you've got any questions to answer or to ask of me, then I can dive in and answer those questions for you. So let's get on with the broadcast. So there's three things I'd like to cover in today's show. And that is about reminding us about really effectively three things that are relevant for the self-employed grant to be made accessible. Number one is about conditions, which basically comes down to three things. It's about the numbers test. So it's about how much profit you've made historically at certain times frames. So that's tick box number one. Tick box number two is about your status. Now, self-employed in the context of a grant application has a specific meaning outside of what we might say normally. So lots of businesses will call themselves self-employed, quite rightly so, but in the context of the grant application, self-employed has a particular meaning, which I'm going to outline and reinforce what that actually is. And number three, there's really the big kernel, the big thing that's causing lots of scratching of heads and people thinking, I'm not quite sure if I'm eligible or not, is this thing that's called adversely affected. And adversely affected has got a particular time frame mentioned in it. I'm going to mention what that is, and I'm going to go through and share some practical examples with you all to shine a light and hopefully make that application process much easier. I think when I was reading earlier on this week, since the gates officially opened for people to make their claims, well in excess of 50,000 people have already made the applications. Don't worry, by the way, if you haven't actually made your application, we've got time on our hands. And again, I'm just going to give you some timetable dates by which you've got to actually make the application accordingly. So by my not death by PowerPoint, I'm going to share my screen, by the way, just to remind myself in terms of some of the key points that I'd like us to look at, like us to cover. It'll be a nice reinforcement for you to actually have a look at as well. And what I'm going to do, let me just dive into a bit of reminding myself what we're going to be talking about. Okay, let's choose the right thing. Just talk amongst yourselves for a couple of minutes while I scroll through here. And there we go, second grant instalment. And basically that's what we're going to have. So I'm going to share my screen, everybody. I'm going to put some slides up here, some nice little bullet points coming up here, so that will remind me and give us a framework what we're going to be covering in the broadcast today. Again, as I said, if you've got questions that pop into your head, no such thing in my experience of a silly question. Pop the question, pop the comment into the comments box here, and I will obviously answer those questions accordingly. So what are we going to do? Let's dive in here. We've got the screen going. I've got my little trusted pointer here. Let's get on the screen and click in that. So we're talking about the second self-employed grant here. Now, before we dive into some of the detail, there is a first grant. That first grant has now stopped, by the way. So if for any reason it transpires as we go through this presentation, you think, actually, I could have claimed that grant. It's unfortunately too late now. The doors are closed. There is no stated right of appeal to that. And therefore, unfortunately, you've just missed out. Unfortunate, but the doors are closed on the first grant. But there is a second, and based on recent pronouncements, there's nothing to suggest the grant will be extended beyond this second one. So the Chancellor Rishi has said this is the second and final grant. So again, we need to make sure that if you're in the framework, that you actually access it. Other things to bear in mind, by the way, some people that I've spoken to have said, you know, which is fine, their outlook, we don't actually need the money, Mahmood, so why should we claim? Nothing in the legislation, nothing in the guidance says the claim is if you need it. It's not a means tested grant. It's basically tick the boxes for eligibility and you can access the grant. So obviously, if you feel I don't actually need the grant, that's entirely your choice. But the grant is not provided based on needs. It's there if you satisfy conditions. So let's crack on. Now, this is, I suppose, condition number one. Now, this is a rehash, a repeating of things that have been there since effectively when the grant application became first available. If anybody's interested in digging into more detail, I've published blogs and videos on this topic before. I'll lay on some comments and links at the end. But as a reminder, it's always good to refresh the memory. So one of the conditions are to be eligible for the self-employed grant was your profit had to be at a certain level. And effectively, your profit, and that is the profit in terms of the tax man, mustn't be over 50 grand. And that's either 50 grand for effectively one particular year, i.e. 18, 19, or averaged over the last 3 years. And that's tax profits itself. If it's over 50k in 1 year, low in the other 2 years, but it averages out over to 50k and below, tick box, you're eligible. The next consideration was what they called income mix. Now, self-employed people, when you complete your tax return, you may have self-employed income as one source, but you may also have other sources of income. So, for example, you may have some property that you're renting out, you may have some pension income, you may have some PAYE income. And what they say is, if your self-employed profits are at least 50% and above, then you're eligible. So if your self-employed profits are below 50% of the total income on your tax return, unfortunately, you don't qualify. The third condition, and this is unfortunate in the sense that some self-employed people who satisfy the first two conditions, satisfy the definition of what self-employed is, will not get this grant and did not get this grant because of when they started their self-employment. So typically, if you started self-employment after the 6th of, well, from the 6th of April 2019 onwards, unfortunately, you are not eligible to claim the grant, and you're not eligible on this grant either. So it's got to be if you started before that date in trading in 1890. More critically, by the way, you have got to have sent your tax return in by the 23rd of April 2020. So if you're like a minority of taxpayers that you know you're self-employed, that whatever reason, circumstances, intransability, intraction, whatever, you didn't actually complete the tax return, tough, you're not going to get a grant. I don't mean that as a very dismissive thing. It's dependent on your tax return having been submitted by that date. Now, the fourth thing which caused a lot of confusion in the early stages, I think it still causes confusion, is this idea of self-employed. Now, when I use the term self-employed as a general conversation piece, I refer to, you know, I'm working for myself, I'm my own boss, I give myself my own orders, I shop my team. And that could be running through a company or running as a self-employed individual. In the context of this grant application, self-employed means that when you complete your tax return, you complete the self-employed pages or the partnership pages. So effectively, you're a sole trader, you're a freelancer, you're a solopreneur, but you're not running your business through a limited company. So if you are in that category of visually thinking about when I complete my tax return, I complete the self-employed pages, or my advisor does, or I complete the partnership pages, then you are classified as self-employed for this particular grant application. If you're running a limited company, and that's it. That's how you run your business, which is some very, good reasons for doing so, you will not be eligible for this grant. So that's the first layer of conditions. We can go tick, tick, tick. We go on to pass and go. Other conditions, as we said, the 18-19 return has to have been submitted, and strictly speaking, you've got to have submitted it by the 23rd of April 2020. Condition number 2 in terms of timing, you've traded during the year 1920. Now, it doesn't specify how long you've traded for, but you've got to be continued trading in that 1920. It doesn't say what level. Number 3, 2021. So we are currently in the tax year 2021, which started on the 6th of April 2020, and it finishes on the 5th of April 2021. Now, it may be that coronavirus has impacted your business to such an extent that actually you've not opened the door for business. So certain industries have been effectively closed down. They're not allowed to open as of yet. If you're one of those businesses and you've not actually traded, you've not done anything since the 6th of April 2020, but you still intend to trade, when things become a bit more gentle, if that makes any sense, when you're allowed to trade, if you're intending to trade in that year, then you're fine. But if you think, I've had enough of it, it's been a really rubbish year, I'm just going to go back to full-time work, then if you cease trading in 2021, then you won't be eligible. Now, here's the 4th condition, if you can call it that, and I think this is the thing that's really confused a lot of people. And I've had clients of mine ring me, I've had non-clients have also approached me and asked me that question about, there's this condition here that says adversely affected. Now, the legislation hasn't really changed, but effectively what has changed is the time frame they're referring to. And so it's always been about, do you meet the status test, i.e., are you self-employed? Do your numbers, i.e., the level of profit that you make, the mix of profit compared to total, the compliance with submitting an 18-19 return, 19-20, does that apply? And it's always been, has your business been adversely affected by coronavirus, by the C-19, whatever sort of acronym that you choose to adopt? Now, what does it mean by this? Now, my interpretation of the guidance notes also that I've read copiously says adversely affected, the way I would visualize it is to say, if coronavirus had not happened at all, let's assume we reset the clock, coronavirus hadn't happened at all, what state would my business actually be in? If I now compare that to coronavirus happening, have I, been adversely affected, disadvantaged? Have I suffered, in some way as a result of coronavirus? If it's a yes, then you're in that adversely affected. If you say, well, actually, it's not made the slightest bit of difference to my business, I've still been able to trade actively because of the nature of what I do. In fact, if anything, I've got greater opportunity as a result, which does happen to some businesses, especially if you're like an online deliver an online business. If there's been no absolute impact whatsoever negatively, you haven't been adversely affected, and therefore you're not eligible. Now, the key thing is, though, the second grant looks at 2 distinct timeframes. It says, first grant was, has it been adversely affected up to and including 13th of July? Stop. The second grant says, has your business continued to be adversely affected by coronavirus? Or it could be a new set of circumstances. So you didn't really suffer in the first time period, but something's happened because of, I'm going to flag this up now, perhaps lockdown restrictions, perhaps in terms of self-isolating, perhaps because of complying with the new guidance rules in terms of social distancing. Something's happened since the 13th of July, and it's now you're being affected, then you're adversely affected. So it's the idea of you continue to be adversely affected, or for the first time, you are adversely affected from the 13th of July, 14th of July 2020 onwards. That's the key thing. So you've got to look at this in 2 distinct timeframes, up to 13th of July and 14th of July onwards. Now, what I want to do on the next presentation is to actually give you a few more practical examples of what we actually mean by this adverse effect, because it can mean lots of things to lots of different businesses. So I want to give you some insight, share some thoughts about what we mean by adverse effect. Okay, let's click this one here. If you catch up on replay, put the hashtag replay in there. I know you're there, obviously, apart from saying hello. I can pick up your comments. If you've got questions to ask, if we don't deal with them during this short broadcast here, then I'm more than happy to pick them up afterwards and make sure you will get an answer to any questions that you've put. So second and final grant. These are some examples. There's not an exhaustive list, but typically some of the examples that you might tap into. So, for example, any government orders here. So, certain areas of the country, and I checked it out this morning, like Greater Manchester, for example, Leicester, my own hometown, other areas, Oldham, etc. If there's government orders dictating restricted activity, lockdown, as we might colloquially call it, and you are self-employed, and you meet all those other conditions here, then your business is adversely affected. So you tick the box, you're eligible to make a claim. If, as a result of the coronavirus, something's happened to your client base, it's shrunk slightly, and remember, there's no such thing as it's got to shrink by a certain magnitude. If it's been affected adversely, then, say, for example, number of clients drops down, then you've been adversely affected, then you meet the criteria. If there's been something like an interruption to your supply chain, so again, if you're physically selling products and there's a difficulty of getting hold of goods, or you might have difficulty getting hold of services, if you bring in and use in subcontractors or freelancers, then there's an interruption to what's called the supply chain. No business works in isolation, so you require certain resources to make your business run, then you've been adversely affected. If you've had contracts to carry out work here and your client says, unfortunately, because of coronavirus, we've got to cancel that contract now, then you've been adversely affected. I'm going to share a few more with you as well. So remember, this is not a comprehensive list. It's certainly some of the key examples. Some of these are actually quoted by HMRC themselves in terms of their guidance notes. They're obsessed for some reason with construction companies, but it's a good here. So they give a number of examples of builders, construction companies, more particularly individual builders who've been adversely affected, and they talk in terms of how it applies there. So probably a good reference point to have a look at. But remember, it affects businesses outside of building. So that's a recap. Government orders. So, where your movements are restricted, you might be in a lockdown area. You might be one of the affected areas there. That's happened since the 13th of July 2020. Fine. It's not fine for your business, but it means you're eligible to make a claim. So what's another category that we can look at? Now, if you're shielding, and we know, again, the guidance has shifted on shielding. There's more of a freer movement going back to work. If you're self-isolating, or if you're having to look after somebody who's vulnerable, and there's a list that's given on the NHS register and the HMRC site. But if you're in that category, you've got a shield, you look after somebody who's vulnerable, you're self-isolating, that's an adverse effect. If social distancing is such, so in other words, if you're running a retail outlet, if you're running a business here where it's impractical to deal with the 2-meter social distancing rules, etc., then you're going to be adversely affected. So typically things like kitchens that might come into that, anything there in your workspace, if it's impractical, it's not possible to actually follow those social distancing rules, then your business will be adversely affected. Increased cost base. Now, it could be that your income is maintaining itself, so you don't actually see a drop in income, but actually compliance with all the new guidance, compliance with the new workspace, compliance to, in terms of having to deliver what you're delivering, and you've seen an increase in costs, maybe because you're buying PPE equipment, you wouldn't have done that before. Perhaps you're buying a greater level of hand sanitizers. We all remember that time in the earlier days of the pandemic where the volume and the price of hand sanitizers shot through the roof. I think toilet paper became a very scarce and expensive commodity as well. I'm not sure what the futures are saying on toilet roll, but again, if your costs have changed they become slightly more or much more, remember there's no quantum, there's no quantification on that figure, then if it's down to coronavirus, then you're adversely affected. Now, if your business is closed or it's not been allowed to open, or you're running on reduced hours, you're having to rotate the opening hours you've got. So some shops, some businesses where they might have been open, let's say between 7 and 7, now might find themselves having to open between 10 and 4. So if there's any reduction of opening hours, any change to opening hours, and it's due to coronavirus, then you're eligible. That's an adverse effect. If you've had to spend more money on childcare, for example, because now the situation is that you're having to spend money on childcare, where prior to that you wouldn't have had to, and it's because of the coronavirus situation, that's an adverse effect. So as a framework, as a reminder, for me, I would visualize it in one of two ways. Business pre-coronavirus, if it never happened at all, and I know it's very difficult to visualize that scenario, and now coronavirus is here, ask yourself honestly, what do I think has there been a negative and adverse impact on my self-employed business? If the answer is yes, there is, then you're eligible. Let's go back here a bit keenly. Now let's overlay some times and some details here, which are really important here. Now the claim, remember, is for circumstances post the 14th of July 2020. So if your business was adversely affected up to, say, the 13th of July and everything's fine now for whatever reason, then you're not eligible to make the second grant claim. So you could have a situation, by the way, that you could claim the first grant, but you may not be eligible to claim the second grant. It may be that you weren't eligible to claim the first grant, but you can claim the second grant. So remember, the claim relates to a continuation of, say, adverse circumstances or new circumstances since the 14th of July. Now, there is time on our hands. So if you haven't made the application yet, don't worry. You've got until the 19th of October 2020 to submit a claim. I'm going to talk to you about who can submit that claim in a moment or two. So the actual claim process has to be done by the 19th of October 2020. After that, it's gone. You won't be able to claim again. So remember, the first grant claim, it finished. You can't retrospectively claim. So if you've missed it, and I have come across a couple of people who haven't claimed for whatever reason, they didn't want to, they didn't feel they should do, they didn't feel they needed the money, which is obviously the wrong reasoning, but unfortunately you can't go back and claim that first grant. It's gone. Now, the level of the grant is slightly less than it was before. So historically, for grant number 1, it was saying, take your taxable profits, take 80% of them, convert that to 3 months. Then that was the claim that you could get. You get it as a one lump. The claim is reduced slightly now to 70% of that figure. So it's taking your average profits, you multiply by 70%, and then you convert that to a 3-month equivalent. That's effectively the level of the grant. And when I say you convert that to, by the way, HMRC, I suppose it's a good thing, are the ones who are doing all the computations. They've got all the information to hand. They are the ones doing the calculations. They are the ones who are telling you. Now, I would add to this, by the way, HMRC have made some mistakes on the earlier claims. They acknowledge it's not significant in the context of 2.7 million claims, but they have admitted that some mistakes have been made on the first claim. They didn't necessarily pick up all the information on the tax return in terms of eligibility and amounts. So some claims have been miscalculated. You are allowed, and this is a good thing here, your agent is also allowed to make that assessment, that review, and apply for it. So if you're thinking, actually, I didn't get as much as I thought I should do, you are entitled to have a review. Your agent is entitled to have a review on your behalf. I mention agents in this case, by the way, and I don't mean like 007. So, for example, a lot of our clients will get us to do a lot of the liaison with HMRC, a lot of the tax work, a lot of the accounts work, understandably. We are their agents. We act on their behalf. We, however, though, are not allowed to submit a claim on their behalf. So if we go in, and I'm going to talk to you about the mechanism in a moment to actually make the claim on their behalf. That's illegal. It's definitely a no-no, and that's classified as a fraudulent claim. So you as the individual taxpayer, you as the individual self-employed person is the one that has to make the claim for this grant. Nobody else can do that for you. Now, as a rule of thumb, by the way, there's a cap before the 13th of July, or up the first grant, I should say. The maximum grant you could get was 7.5K, which is about, profit terms, about 37.5 grand. Rule of thumb I gave people at that time was to say, if you look at your profits that have been averaged out there, 20% of that will be the level of the grant. As a ready reckoner, if you're a business that's got, let's say, £20,000 worth of taxable profits, 17.5% of that will be the grant that you'll get if you meet all the conditions. The maximum grant that you can get is £6,570. So again, 10 grand's worth of profits, you meet all the other conditions, 1,750 is your grant. It's paid as a lump sum, by the way, so it's not dripped in. It's paid as a single lump sum, and I'm going to talk to you at the end about the impact on tax, VAT, and NIC that you need to be aware of as well going forward. So again, 17.5%, maximum payout 6,570. Now, I think what's probably going to be useful, let me bring this next part of the slide on. The claim process, by the way, is you should have all received what I call a letter. So a letter HMRC would or should have written to all taxpayers telling them about their eligibility, but they'll also write to them indicating the time they want you to make the application. So the claims are going to be staggered. If you have not received a letter, don't panic. I said we've got until October time, 19th of October, to make the claim. So if you haven't received a letter, if you haven't received any correspondence from HMRC as to your second grant, go on to the HMRC. There's an eligibility checker. You need your national insurance number and you need your unique tax reference. It's a 10-digit number. So tap in your 10-digit tax reference, tap in your national insurance number, and it will tell you at that stage whether you're eligible for the claim. If you're eligible for the claim, there's a link that will say to go off and make the claim. And you need, if you haven't got one of these, you will need what's called a personal government tax account. If you haven't set one up, I strongly urge you to do one, otherwise you won't get anything. Again, if you need any help on doing that, drop me a comment in the links box and I'll send you some information across later on. So put a link, so make sure you've got a government tax account, and make sure you've also got a UK bank account there as well. Those might seem quite academic points, by the way, but you actually need all those things. So if you haven't got a letter, UTR, unique tax reference, it's called, it's 10 digits. If you can't find it, look at any correspondence you've got from HMRC, speak to your accountants, they should tell you what it is. National insurance number, that's the two things to check if you're eligible and when you can claim. Click the link, make the claim. You need a personal tax account, you need your bank account, and it's quite straightforward. It takes about 10-15 minutes to go through the process. Now, here's a key thing. I think a lot of people are actually thinking, yeah, I'm just going to make the claim, job done. Be aware, HMRC have been given authority and power and legislation to deal with what they call investigation claims and fraudulent claims here. So a lot of people accidentally and deliberately, unfortunately, have actually what I call scammed the system. If it's accidentally, you didn't know you weren't eligible, that's fine. You'll be dealt with slightly differently. If you deliberately claim when you know you're not eligible, that's going to be classified as fraud, and there's a special regime that deals with that. So make sure you've got something to back up your actual claim for eligibility that you've been adversely affected. Now, the numbers you don't have to worry about. It's the actual adverse impact. Now, what this means is when you actually submit the claim, you do not have to submit any information at that stage. HMRC reserve the right to come back to you and ask the question of you. So I would suggest if it's something like you've lost the number of customers, it's been reduced, well, I would perhaps just make a screenshot, a note saying my customer base was X, here's some evidence. My customer base is now Y. I can pinpoint that because I can see some emails or something that confirms the cancellation, or clients saying, I'm sorry, but we can't, afford to continue. We've been affected by the coronavirus. So remember, it's got to have been linked to the coronavirus, not because they didn't actually want your services anymore for another reason. If it's because you've had to invest more money in there, have some evidence. Your account system should track the investment in PPE, the cost of buying hand sanitizers that you didn't have before. If it's because you've lost some contracts, is there an email indicating that? So just make sure you've got the evidence. If you don't, you're going to be on the back foot. You're going to find it very difficult to refute that itself. Now, it does have an impact on tax, national insurance, and VAT. This is a grant. It's not a gift. It's not a loan, but it's a grant, which means it's not repayable unless you've accidentally or otherwise made the claim. It is taxable, so you will be paying income tax on that grant. It is subject to national insurance contributions. So as a self-employed individual, you will be paying national insurance contributions linked to that grant. Now, VAT, nothing specifically has been mentioned in the legislation. So if you're a small business, a self-employed business with turnover below 85,000 and you're not VAT registered, that's fine. When the grant comes in, it may be such that it tips you over that level and you then think, oh my God, I have to register for VAT. Interpretation is the grant, as with all normal grants, is outside the scope of VAT. So it should have no impact on affecting your turnover limits for VAT, which also means, by the way, that there is no VAT recoverable in relation to the grant as well. So it's outside the scope, brackets exempt from VAT. I think the last couple of things I want to share with everybody is this thing called penalties. Now, there has been some coverage, some press, some comments about, oh, actually, if you get it wrong, nobody's going to know. Let me tell you, by the way, you misunderstand and you probably underestimate the powers of HMRC. If it's investigated, now, let me reinforce, if it's an innocent mistake and you weren't aware that you weren't eligible for the grant, you took it in good faith, what will happen is that HMRC will ask you just to pay that money back. Typically, if it's an innocent mistake and they come back to you later on and say, by the way, we're just checking your return, we're just checking everything here, can you give us some information as to why you thought you were eligible? If you write back to them and they say, well, actually, that's not really quite within what we meant here in the guidance, you think, oh, okay, got it wrong. You've got until January 2022 to pay it back. And it's January 22, by the way, because the grant, if it's paid as it will be in 2020, will go into your 2021 personal tax return, and that is all due to be paid, any tax on that, and filed by January 2022. So it's all going to be dealt with through that mechanism. Now, if you know that you shouldn't have claimed the grant in the first place, and this applies to the first or second, or because of ineligibility, then you've got a window to pay that back by. If you claim the second grant and then you think, oh, actually, I shouldn't have done that, then you've got until October to pay it back. Now, here's what happens if you don't. Depending on the nature of why you claimed it, if you claimed it incorrectly, if it's innocent, that's a slightly less of a punitive regime. If it's deliberate, if they catch you, then you could have a penalty imposed, anything between 30 and 100% of the grant that you've claimed. Now, I'm not trying to scare people. I would certainly not discourage anyone from claiming if you're eligible. All it's saying is check the conditions, check the adverse situation. If you're eligible, claim it. It doesn't matter, by the way, if your turnover by the end of effectively 5th of April 2021 tends to be the same, you don't feel you've suffered overall, it's irrelevant. Okay, so it's not tied to monetary drops, it's not tied to turnover drops. You could end up with 2021 being an overall good year by the time you get to the end of it. But if your business has been adversely affected 14th of July onwards, then you're eligible if all the other conditions are met. Now, scammers, unfortunately, like in all things life, there are pieces of shit, excuse my French there, scammers who will come and try and take advantage and exploit a situation. So be very careful. If you get a third party approaching you saying, we can make the claim on your behalf, then ignore them, delete them, and perhaps report them. HMRC will be the ones that will actually invite you to claim. If you've not heard anything, then comment accordingly. Okay, folks, listen, I hope you've got some value out of this broadcast. Hope there's things in there. If you're not quite sure whether it applies to you, then shoot me a comment. I'll answer that accordingly. If you've got any feedback, you're not, again, any element of uncertainty, you want some additional information, drop me a comment in the links and I'll share some information with you accordingly. So listen, I put a little on the screen here. I put Love My Accountant down on 25th of August 2020. I'm going to make some further announcement of that later on. So if you are around, you like Twitter, LinkedIn and other platforms, then I'd love you to join in the day. This is not about me, by the way, it's about the world of accountancy. But for now, good luck with the claims. If you're eligible, please, my personal advice would be, don't stand on ceremony. Apply if you meet the conditions and don't sit back and think, well, you know, other people need it more than I do. That may or may not be true, but it's there. You've paid into the system. We've all paid into the system. Make the claim and good luck with your businesses. And I'll see you guys next week.